Don't do this." Her voice cracked like glass under boots. Blood smeared across her temple where the rifle stock had split her skin. Her wrists were bound so tight behind the post that her fingers had gone numb an hour ago. Gracelyn Baker's knees buckled, but the rope around her waist kept her upright, kept her displayed like a broken doll in the center of Tombstone's main street. The midday sun of 1887 Arizona blazed down without mercy. Dust clung to her torn blouse. Her breathing came shallow and fast. A crowd had gathered, silent, waiting. Some looked away. Others stared like she was already a ghost. Marshal Wade Carrington stood 10 paces in front of her, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. His face was stone. No pity, no hesitation, just cold authority dressed in a tin star. Gracelyn lifted her head, eyes burning with something fiercer than fear. "I took your money," she whispered, "but you took a life." The marshal's jaw tightened. The crowd murmured. Then came the sound of a horse, slow and deliberate, cutting through the tension like a blade. A man appeared from the shimmer of heat rising off the desert road, tall, broad-shouldered, weathered by years under the sun. His name was Caleb Thorne, a cattle rancher in his late 40s who had seen too much cruelty to stay quiet anymore. He dismounted without a word, his boots hitting the dirt with purpose. His eyes locked onto Gracelyn, then onto the marshal. The whole town held its breath. Caleb reached for the knife on his belt. If this story grabs you by the heart and won't let go, hit that subscribe button. Stories like this don't survive unless people care enough to pass them on. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from right now. Let's keep the truth alive together. Caleb didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for the law to speak first. He walked straight to the post where Gracelyn hung like bait, his knife flashing once in the brutal Arizona sun. The rope snapped. Gracelyn collapsed forward into his arms, gasping like she'd been pulled from deep water. Her legs gave out completely. If he had arrived 5 minutes later, she would have been gone. The crowd erupted. Voices rose in shock, anger, confusion. Marshal Carrington's hand flew to his gun, but he didn't draw. Not yet. Too many eyes watching. Too many witnesses who might have questions later. Caleb lowered Gracelyn to the ground in the shade of a wooden overhang. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and tipped water to her cracked lips. She drank too fast, coughed, then drank again. Her eyes stayed locked on his face like she was trying to figure out if he was real or just another cruel trick. "You know what you just did?" the marshal called out, his voice sharp as a whip crack. Caleb stood slowly, turning to face him. "I know exactly what I did." The crowd went silent. Marshal Carrington stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dirt. "That girl is a thief. She broke into my office, opened my safe, took $300 that belonged to the Territorial Fund." Caleb didn't flinch. "So you tied her to a post in the sun to die slow? That's what you call justice?" "That's what I call a warning," the marshal shot back. Gracelyn's voice came out raw and broken. "I stole it, because you murdered the man it belonged to." Every eye in Tombstone turned to Gracelyn. She was still sitting in the dirt, her wrists bruised and bleeding from the ropes, but her voice didn't waver. "His name was Samuel Cross," she said. "Wells Fargo courier. He came through Tombstone 3 weeks ago with a leather bag full of territorial payroll. He never made it to Tucson." Marshal Carrington's face went red. "You're a liar and a thief, girl. Don't make it worse by throwing wild stories around." Caleb stepped between them. "If she's lying, then why are you so rattled?" The marshal's hand dropped to his gun again. This time it stayed there. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some folks started to back away. Others leaned in closer, hungry for the truth. Gracelyn pushed herself to her feet, leaning on the overhang post. I was cleaning the jailhouse that night. Late. You thought I'd gone home. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. I heard a man arguing with you. He said you took the money meant for the soldiers at Fort Huachuca. You told him to keep his mouth shut. Then I heard the gunshot. The silence that followed was thick as smoke. Marshal Carrington's face went from red to white. She's delirious, he said quickly. Heat got to her head. Caleb crossed his arms. Then you won't mind if we send a wire to Wells Fargo. Ask if Samuel Cross ever made it to Tucson. The marshal's eyes flickered. Just for a second. But it was enough. Gracelyn took a shaky breath. I saw you drag his body out the back door. You loaded him into a wagon and drove south toward the hills. I followed you that night. I know where you buried him. Marshal Carrington didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. The deputy standing behind him did it for him. A young man named Byers, nervous and loyal, raised his rifle and pointed it straight at Caleb's chest. Nobody moves, Byers said, his voice cracking. The crowd scattered like spooked cattle. Women grabbed their children, men ducked behind storefronts. In seconds, the street was nearly empty except for Caleb, Gracelyn, the marshal, and his deputy. Caleb didn't reach for his own gun. He stood perfectly still, hands at his sides. You really want to shoot me in front of what's left of this town? He asked calmly. Byers hesitated. His rifle wavered. Marshal Carrington stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. You cut down my prisoner, Thorne. You interfered with the law. That's a crime. What you did to her wasn't law, Caleb said. It was cruelty. Gracelyn's voice cut through the tension. If you kill us both, people will ask why. They'll wonder what you were hiding, and eventually, someone will ride out to those hills and start digging. The marshal's jaw clenched so hard it looked like his teeth might crack. He knew she was right, but he also knew that letting them walk away meant the truth could spread. He couldn't afford that. Not with a bag full of stolen gold buried under a cairn of rocks south of town. Caleb took a step toward his horse. We're leaving, he said. You can shoot us in the back if you want, but you'll have to explain it to the army when they come asking about their missing payroll. The marshal's hand twitched. Byers looked to him for orders. Caleb lifted Gracelyn onto his horse and swung up behind her. She was trembling, her body still weak from the sun and the ropes. But her eyes stayed sharp, watching the marshal's every move. Marshal Carrington didn't lower his hand from his gun. If you leave Tombstone, you're outlaws, he said. I'll have a warrant out by sundown. Caleb didn't answer. He just spurred the horse forward, slow and steady, riding straight down the center of the street. Byers raised his rifle again. The marshal held up a hand to stop him. Not here. Not now. Too many windows. Too many witnesses still peeking through the cracks. As Caleb and Gracelyn rode out of town, the marshal turned to Byers. Get 3 men. Fast horses. I want them found before they reach the fort. Gracelyn leaned back against Caleb's chest, her voice barely audible. He'll kill us both if he catches us. I know, Caleb said. That's why we're not stopping. They followed the old stage road south toward Fort Huachuca, riding hard through the heat. The Arizona desert stretched out in every direction, dry and merciless. Behind them, dust rose on the horizon. Riders, coming fast. Gracelyn's heart hammered. How far to the fort? 10 miles, Caleb said. Maybe 12. She looked back. The riders were gaining. They'll catch us before we get there. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, don't keep it to yourself. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Let's build a community that cares about stories like this. Hit that like button if you want to see how this ends. The riders came like thunder. 3 of them, led by Deputy Byers with Marshal Carrington himself riding hard on the left flank. They weren't shouting. They weren't threatening. They were just closing the distance with the cold efficiency of men who had done this before. Caleb pushed his horse faster, but the animal was already struggling. It had carried 2 people for miles in brutal heat. It couldn't outrun fresh horses. Gracelyn gripped the saddle horn, her knuckles white. "We're not going to make it." "Yes, we are," Caleb said through gritted teeth. He veered off the main road, cutting east toward a narrow canyon he knew from years of running cattle through this country. The terrain was rocky, dangerous, but it would slow the marshal's men down. The canyon walls rose up on both sides, red stone glowing in the late afternoon sun. The path narrowed. Caleb's horse stumbled once, caught itself, kept moving. Behind them, the sound of hooves echoed off the rock. Closer now, too close. Caleb reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a Winchester rifle. He handed the reins to Gracelyn. "Keep her steady." "What are you doing?" Gracelyn asked, her voice tight with fear. "Buying us time." He twisted in the saddle, aimed back toward the canyon entrance, and fired. The shot cracked like lightning. One of the marshal's horses reared, throwing its rider. The other 2 pulled up hard, taking cover behind a boulder. Caleb fired again. This time the bullet sparked off stone inches from Byers' head. The deputy ducked, cursing. Caleb turned back around. "Go. Now!" Gracelyn kicked the horse forward. They burst out of the canyon just as the sun began to sink. Fort Huachuca appeared in the distance, a cluster of adobe buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade. Soldiers moved along the walls. Smoke rose from cook fires. Safety. Maybe. Caleb and Gracelyn rode straight for the gate, their horse barely able to stand by the time they reached it. A sentry stepped forward, rifle raised. "State your business!" Caleb slid off the horse, his legs shaking. "We need to see your commanding officer. Now!" The sentry looked at Gracelyn, at her torn clothes and bruised wrists, at the blood on her face. He looked back at Caleb, whose rifle was still smoking. "Who's chasing you?" "The law," Gracelyn said. The sentry's eyes narrowed. "Then maybe you belong with them." Before Caleb could argue, the sound of hooves echoed from the canyon. Marshal Carrington and his men appeared, riding hard toward the fort. The sentry raised his rifle. "Nobody moves." The marshal reined in his horse, his face slick with sweat and fury. He held up his badge. "I'm Marshal Wade Carrington out of Tombstone. That man and that girl are wanted criminals. They assaulted an officer of the law and fled justice." The sentry looked to Caleb. "That true?" Caleb met his eyes. "She witnessed a murder. The marshal killed a Wells Fargo courier named Samuel Cross and stole the payroll he was carrying. We're here to report it to your commander." Marshal Carrington's face went dark. "That's a lie." Gracelyn stepped forward, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Then why did you bury him in the hills south of Tombstone? And why is the bag he was carrying locked in your safe?" The commanding officer at Fort Huachuca was a captain named Garrett, a man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many wars to be fooled easily. He sat behind a wooden desk in his office, listening without interruption as Gracelyn told her story. Caleb stood beside her. Marshal Carrington stood across the room, flanked by his 2 remaining deputies. Captain Garrett leaned back in his chair. "You're saying you witnessed this marshal shoot a Wells Fargo courier in cold blood?" "Yes, sir," Gracelyn said. "And you stole money from his safe afterward?" "Yes, sir." The captain's eyes flicked to the marshal. "And you tied her to a post in the sun as punishment?" Marshal Carrington straightened. "She's a thief. I had every right to discipline her as I saw fit." Discipline, the captain repeated, his voice flat. Is that what you call it? The marshal didn't answer. Captain Garrett stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the desert. Wells Fargo reported a missing courier 3 weeks ago. Samuel Cross. He was carrying $6,000 in territorial payroll meant for this fort. He turned back to face them. That money never arrived. Gracelyn's breath caught. 6,000, not 300. The marshal had lied even about how much he stole. The captain looked at Marshal Carrington. If this girl is telling the truth, then you're not just a murderer. You're a thief who stole from the United States Army. The marshal's hand moved toward his gun. Every soldier in the room raised their rifles. He froze. Captain Garrett's voice was cold as iron. You'll surrender your weapon, now. Captain Garrett sent a detachment of 10 soldiers back to Tombstone with Caleb and Gracelyn as guides. They rode south into the hills where Gracelyn said the body was buried. The land was harsh and empty, dotted with scrub brush and jagged rock. Gracelyn led them to a shallow arroyo where a pile of stones had been stacked in a rough cairn. There, she said, pointing. The soldiers dismounted and began moving the rocks. It didn't take long. Beneath the stones, wrapped in a canvas tarp, they found the remains of a man. His clothes were torn and stained, but the Wells Fargo badge was still pinned to his vest. Captain Garrett knelt beside the body, his face grim. He reached into the tarp and pulled out a leather satchel, empty except for a torn receipt with the Wells Fargo stamp still visible. One of the soldiers crossed himself. Another looked away. Caleb stood beside Gracelyn, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. She didn't cry. She just stared at the grave, her jaw set. He had a family, she whispered. I saw the photograph in his coat pocket. A wife. 2 children. Captain Garrett stood holding the satchel. They'll know the truth now. Because of you. Gracelyn shook her head. Because of him. She nodded toward Caleb. He's the one who cut me down when everyone else just walked past. The captain looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Caleb shook it. You did the right thing, Mr. Thorne. Even when it cost you. Cost me? Caleb asked. The captain's face darkened. The marshal's deputies are still in Tombstone, and they're spreading the story that you murdered their boss. By the time they rode back into Tombstone, the town was simmering with tension. Word had spread that Marshal Carrington had been arrested by the army. Some folks said he was innocent. Others said it was about time someone stood up to him. But the loudest voices belonged to the marshal's men. Deputy Byers and 2 others had taken over the jailhouse. They'd armed themselves with rifles and barricaded the doors. They claimed Caleb Thorne was a murderer who had conspired with a thief to frame a good lawman. They demanded justice. The soldiers surrounded the jailhouse. Captain Garrett called for Byers to surrender. Byers refused. We don't answer to the army, he shouted from the window. This is a territorial matter. Gracelyn stepped forward, her voice ringing out across the street. Samuel Cross was your friend, wasn't he, Byers? You rode with him on the stage line before you pinned on that badge. Byers went silent. You knew him, Gracelyn continued. You knew his wife's name, his children, and you stood by while the marshal murdered him for money. The window went dark. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door to the jailhouse opened. Byers stepped out, his rifle lowered, his face pale. I didn't know, he said quietly. I swear I didn't know what he did. Captain Garrett nodded. Then you'll testify. Byers dropped his rifle and walked toward the soldiers, his hands raised. The other deputies followed. Tombstone exhaled. Weeks later, Marshal Wade Carrington stood trial in Tucson. The evidence was overwhelming. The body, the stolen payroll, Gracelyn's testimony. He was found guilty of murder and theft. He was hanged on a cold November morning. Gracelyn stayed on at Caleb Thorne's ranch. She worked the land, mended fences, learned to ride without fear. On quiet evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the Arizona sky turn gold and purple. She never forgot the day she hung on that post. But she also never forgot the man who cut her down when the whole town turned away. Sometimes justice only happens because one person refuses to look past someone else's suffering. If this story moved you, then subscribe. Not because I'm asking, but because stories like this deserve to be heard. Hit that like button.